When you picture World War I, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For almost everyone, it's the trenches, and for a very good reason. This wasn't just some military tactic. It became the defining, brutal symbol of the entire Western Front. But what was it really like? We're going to go beyond those grainy black and white photos and get into the reality of this industrial age stalemate. First, just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this. We're not talking about a few scattered forts here. I want you to imagine a massive, festering wound carved across the face of Europe. A continuous line of ditches stretching all the way from the North Sea down to the Swiss border. An entire continent literally bisected by mud and barbed wire. So what even is trench warfare when you boil it down? Well, it's a type of fighting where victory isn't measured in miles conquered, but in blood-soaked inches of ground. The whole goal shifted from these grand, sweeping maneuvers to just holding a fortified ditch. And that fundamental change is what created the horrific, years-long deadlock that came to define the war. So let's start with that big picture. How did this horrifying stalemate happen? How did it lock millions of men in place for years, basically turning a continent into a prison of mud? Okay, now let's zoom in. Because if you're picturing just a simple hole in the ground, you are really missing the terrifying genius of their design. These weren't just ditches, they were sophisticated, highly engineered systems built for killing. Just look at this. It's like a deadly underground city with different neighborhoods. Right up front, you had the firing line, the place of maximum danger, staring right at the enemy. If that line was ever breached, you'd fall back to the support trench. Even further back were the reserve trenches, holding fresh troops and precious supplies. And connecting this whole deadly web, these communication trenches. They were the vital arteries that allowed men and materials to move around, all of it hidden from the enemy's view. And every single one of these lines was a fortress. I mean, just imagine trying to cross a field choked with these massive tangles of barbed wire, all while hidden machine gun nests and snipers were sighting you in. Every single element was designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to make any attack an absolute suicide mission. So that's the structure. But what was it actually like to live in one of those things? Now we're going to shift from the engineering of the trench to the daily, miserable experience of the soldier who was stuck inside it. This simple statement it says everything, doesn't it? There was no escape. It was just a constant grinding misery, broken up only by moments of absolute terror. Just surviving was a minute-by-minute struggle. Artillery shells could rain down at any moment, without warning. A sniper's bullet could find you if you dared peek your head over the top for even a second. Raiding parties could strike in the dead of night. And then there was the silent, creeping horror of poison gas. And beyond the enemy trying to kill you, the environment itself was a killer. The constant mud and water led to trench foot, this horrific infection that could rot the flesh off your feet and lead to amputation. Hordes of rats, sometimes as big as cats, feeding on scraps and human remains, spread disease everywhere. Even the food was often contaminated. It was an absolutely unlivable existence. So, if life inside the trench was that bad, can you imagine being ordered to leave it? This brings us to the single most terrifying moment for any soldier, hearing the order to go over the top. The plan for an assault was always brutally, tragically the same. First, a massive artillery bombardment, sometimes lasting for days to supposedly soften up the enemy. Then, the whistles would blow, and that was the signal for thousands of men to climb out of their trench and charge across that cratered hellscape called No Man's Land, running directly into a storm of machine gun fire. The human cost of these attacks, it's just staggering. It wasn't uncommon for a single offensive to rack up tens of thousands of casualties in just a matter of hours. And this, right here, is the insane, heartbreaking math of the Western Front. All that bloodshed, all that horror, for what? For a few hundred yards of shattered earth, territory that could easily be lost in a counterattack the very next day. That is the absolute core tragedy of trench warfare. But the wounds of this war weren't just the ones you could see. The constant stress, the terror, it was leaving deep, invisible scars. So for our final section, let's zoom right into the mind of the soldier. Out of this conflict, a new term was born for an old, misunderstood horror: shell shock.
That was the name they gave to the severe psychological trauma that came from the unending strain of combat and the sheer terror of being under constant artillery fire.
The symptoms were just devastating. Men were left completely unable to fight, sometimes unable to even speak or control their own bodies. And what's so tragic is that at the time, this was often mistaken for cowardice. We know now it was a complete and total breakdown of the nervous system under unbearable pressure. And this is just so important to remember. For the hundreds of thousands of men who survived the trenches, the war didn't just end in 1918. For them, the emotional and psychological battle continued for the rest of their lives. So, when we look back, the trenches really stand as the ultimate symbol of the true cost of industrialized war. It's a terrifying lesson in what happens when the technology of killing, like the machine gun, leaps far ahead of the old world strategies of fighting. You get a brutal, dehumanizing stalemate on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. And all of this leaves us with a pretty haunting question. It's not just about how warfare has changed, but about how it changes the soldier. What does it do to a person when the enemy isn't just the man in the opposite trench, but also the mud, the rats, and the very ground you live on?